The rain fell steadily on the small town of Ashford in Kent, creating puddles that reflected the gray November sky. Sarah Mitchell stood at the window of her modest terraced house, watching her 8-year-old daughter Emma play with a worn teddy bear. The little girl's laughter filled the room, a bright spot in what had been months of darkness for their family. Sarah's husband, James, had been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer 6 months earlier. The former construction worker, once strong and vibrant, now spent most days in the hospital receiving treatment. Their savings had quickly depleted, and Sarah had been forced to leave her part-time job at the local library to care for both James and Emma. The bills kept coming, but the money had stopped. Unknown to Sarah, her story had reached unexpected ears through a chain of coincidences that would later seem almost miraculous. It began with Margaret Thompson, a retired nurse who volunteered at the hospital where James received treatment. Margaret had been deeply moved by the young family's struggle, particularly by Sarah's determination to keep life as normal as possible for Emma despite their circumstances. Margaret's niece, Lucy, worked as a junior staff member at a charity organization in London that occasionally received support from members of the royal family. During a family dinner, Margaret had shared the Mitchell family's story, not seeking help but simply expressing her concern for the young mother who spent every possible moment at her husband's bedside while trying to shield her daughter from the harsh realities they faced. Lucy had been particularly touched by one detail Margaret shared. Emma had recently started school, and while other children excitedly talked about their upcoming Christmas plans and wish lists, Emma had quietly told her teacher that all she wanted was for her daddy to come home. The teacher, Mrs. Patricia Coleman, had noticed that Emma's lunchbox often contained just a sandwich and an apple, while her shoes showed signs of being carefully repaired with glue. The story might have ended there, just another tale of a family facing hardship. But Lucy's supervisor at the charity happened to mention it during a routine meeting with Palace staff about upcoming charitable initiatives. The aide who heard the story was struck by the family's dignity in the face of such challenges and made a brief note in a report that crossed several desks before landing in a pile of correspondence reviewed by Prince William's private office. William and Catherine had always maintained a deep commitment to helping families in crisis, but they preferred to do so quietly, without fanfare or media attention. They believed that true charity happened in the shadows, away from cameras and headlines. When William read about the Mitchell family during his evening review of charitable cases, something about their story resonated deeply with him. Perhaps it was because he thought of his own children, imagining how devastating it would be for them to face such uncertainty. Or maybe it was Sarah's quiet strength, working tirelessly to maintain normalcy for Emma while her world crumbled around her. Whatever the reason, William found himself unable to stop thinking about the family in Kent. That evening, as he and Catherine sat in their private living room after putting their children to bed, William shared the story. Catherine listened intently, her eyes filling with tears, as William described Emma's simple Christmas wish and Sarah's daily struggle to balance hospital visits with school runs, all while watching their finances dwindle to nothing. "We should help them," Catherine said simply, reaching for William's hand. But quietly, "The last thing they need is media attention on top of everything else." William nodded, already thinking about how they could assist without creating a spectacle. They had learned over the years that sometimes the most meaningful help came not from grand gestures, but from practical support that addressed real, immediate needs. Over the next few days, William and Catherine worked with a trusted aide to learn more about the Mitchell family. They discovered that James had been a skilled carpenter before his illness, taking pride in his work and often helping neighbors with repairs free of charge. Sarah had been pursuing a degree in education through evening classes before their lives were upturned. They were the kind of people who had always been givers rather than takers, making their current situation even more difficult for them to bear. The royal couple also learned about the specific challenges the family faced. The house needed several repairs that James would have easily handled himself before his illness. The heating system was failing, and Sarah had been heating only the essential rooms to save money. Emma's school uniform was becoming too small, but Sarah couldn't afford to replace it. Most heartbreaking of all, the family was 3 months behind on their mortgage payments, and foreclosure notices had begun arriving. As William and Catherine gathered this information, they were struck by how many families across Britain faced similar struggles. Illness, job loss, or unexpected circumstances could push anyone to the brink. But they also believed that helping one family completely could create ripples of hope that extended far beyond that single act of kindness. They began to formulate a plan, one that would address not just the Mitchell family's immediate needs, but also provide them with a foundation for rebuilding their lives. The key was to do it in a way that preserved the family's dignity and privacy. William reached out to several trusted associates, including successful business owners who shared his commitment to quiet philanthropy. He explained the situation and asked for their help, not as a royal command, but as one human being to another. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People wanted to help. They just needed someone to coordinate the effort. Meanwhile, Catherine focused on the personal touches that would make the help feel less like charity and more like community support. She understood the psychology of receiving help, how it could feel both welcome and uncomfortable. Her goal was to ensure that Sarah and her family felt supported rather than pitied. As December approached, the pieces of their plan began to fall into place. They had arranged for all the immediate financial pressures to be relieved, but they wanted to do more than just pay bills. They wanted to give the family hope and a path forward. Catherine spent hours selecting items that Emma might enjoy, remembering her own childhood and what had brought her joy at that age. She chose books that would transport the little girl to magical worlds, art supplies to encourage creativity, and warm winter clothes that any 8-year-old would be excited to wear. Everything was chosen with care, nothing so extravagant as to seem out of place in the Mitchell home, but all of good quality that would last. William, meanwhile, worked on the practical aspects. He arranged for a trusted contractor to assess and repair the house, ensuring the work would be done quickly and efficiently. He set up an education fund for Emma and arranged for Sarah's university fees to be covered so she could complete her degree when life settled down. He even researched James's treatment plan, consulting with medical experts to ensure the family had access to the best possible care. As they finalized their plans, both William and Catherine felt a familiar sense of purpose. This was why their position mattered, not for the ceremonies or the palaces, but for the ability to make a real difference in people's lives. They had resources and connections that could transform a family's prospects, and they considered it not just a privilege, but a responsibility to use them wisely. The execution of their plan required careful coordination. They worked with local organizations in Ashford to ensure everything appeared to come from the community rather than from them specifically. They wanted Sarah to feel that her neighbors and fellow citizens were rallying around her, which would be more sustainable and meaningful than help from distant benefactors. One cold December morning, as Sarah prepared for another hospital visit, she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Mrs. Henderson from down the street, holding a casserole dish and wearing a warm smile. Behind her stood several other neighbors, all carrying food, supplies, or offering help with household tasks. "We've been meaning to do this for weeks," Mrs. Henderson said, pressing the warm dish into Sarah's hands. "You've been carrying too much on your own, dear. Let us help." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as neighbor after neighbor expressed their support. What she didn't know was that this seemingly spontaneous outpouring had been carefully orchestrated, with William and Catherine working behind the scenes to ensure every detail was perfect. As the neighbors bustled around her kitchen, filling her freezer with home-cooked meals and her cupboards with groceries, Sarah felt a weight begin to lift from her shoulders. She had been so focused on being strong that she hadn't realized how much she needed this support. That evening, when Sarah returned from the hospital, she found Emma playing happily with Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter. The house was warm, the heating having mysteriously started working again after a routine maintenance check by the Housing Association. Emma excitedly told her mother about the nice man who had come to fix things, how he had let her help by holding his tools. Over the following days, more surprises arrived. An envelope pushed through the letterbox contained a letter from the mortgage company, stating that an administrative review had found they had been overcharged and the overpayment would cover the missed payments with money to spare. Sarah stared at the letter in disbelief, reading it over and over to make sure she understood correctly. Emma's school called to say she had been selected for a special program that would provide new uniforms and school supplies. The head teacher, Mrs. Wilson, explained it was part of a new initiative to support families going through difficult times. When Sarah tried to ask more questions, Mrs. Wilson simply said that sometimes good things happened when communities came together. The transformation in their lives was gradual but profound. The practical support relieved immediate pressures, but it was the sense of not being alone that truly changed everything. Sarah found herself sleeping better, able to focus more fully on James during hospital visits without the constant worry about bills and basic needs. James, too, noticed the change. His wife seemed lighter, more like the woman he had fallen in love with years ago. When she told him about the support they were receiving, he wept openly, not from sadness, but from gratitude. He had carried such guilt about his inability to provide for his family during his illness. Knowing they were cared for gave him peace, and, his doctors noted, seemed to improve his response to treatment. As Christmas approached, the Mitchell house took on a different atmosphere. Where there had been stress and worry, there was now hope. Emma's laughter rang out more freely, and she began talking excitedly about Santa Claus and decorating their small tree. What the family didn't know was that William and Catherine were carefully monitoring their progress, receiving updates through their network of helpers. They took joy in each small improvement, each moment of happiness they had helped create. This was what mattered to them, not the recognition or praise, but the knowledge that one family's life had been transformed. The story of their involvement might have remained secret forever if not for a single photograph that would later capture the nation's heart. But in those early December days, as the Mitchell family began to heal and hope, the secret remained safe. William and Catherine continued their official duties, attending ceremonies and making public appearances, all while knowing that their most important work was happening quietly in a small house in Kent. Sarah, standing in her warm kitchen one evening, watching Emma decorate cookies with their elderly neighbor, felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. She didn't know who to thank for this miraculous turn in their fortunes, so she simply whispered a prayer of gratitude to the universe, hoping it would find its way to whoever had orchestrated this kindness. In London, at that very moment, Catherine was tucking her own children into bed. As she kissed them goodnight, she thought of Emma and felt a deep satisfaction. This was what privilege should be used for, not for personal gain, but for lifting others. She and William had been given much, and with that came the responsibility to give back, quietly and without expectation of thanks. The first phase of their plan had been successfully executed. The Mitchell family's immediate needs were met, and a foundation for future stability was in place. But William and Catherine's involvement was far from over. They had committed to seeing this through, to ensuring that the help provided would lead to lasting change rather than temporary relief. As December progressed, they continued to monitor and support from afar, always careful to maintain the illusion that the help came from the community rather than from them. It was a delicate balance, requiring constant attention and adjustment, but they were determined to see it through, knowing that the story of the Mitchell family could inspire others to similar acts of kindness. Little did they know that their carefully guarded secret was about to be revealed in the most unexpected way, setting in motion events that would indeed move the nation like never before. But for now, in the quiet of December evenings, two families in very different circumstances were united by an invisible thread of compassion, each playing their part in a story that would soon capture the hearts of millions. The week before Christmas brought an unexpected snowfall to Ashford, transforming the town into a winter wonderland. Emma pressed her nose against the window, watching the flakes drift down, her breath fogging the glass. For the first time in months, she felt the pure joy that should be every child's birthright, unburdened by the adult worries that had crept into her young life. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing lunch with ingredients from their now well-stocked cupboards. The transformation in their circumstances still felt surreal. Every morning she woke, expecting to find it had all been a dream, but the warmth of the house, the full refrigerator, and the absence of threatening letters reminded her it was real. What happened next would change everything, though no one could have predicted it at the time. It began with a simple decision by William and Catherine to make one final gesture before Christmas. They had been receiving updates about James's treatment and learned that he might be able to come home for Christmas Day, though he would need to return to the hospital the following morning. The couple wanted to ensure this precious day would be perfect for the family. Catherine had personally selected a special Christmas hamper, filled not with extravagant items, but with thoughtful touches that would make the day memorable. She included a small turkey, all the trimmings for a traditional Christmas dinner, crackers, a modest but beautiful Christmas pudding, and a selection of games and activities the family could enjoy together. She had spent considerable time thinking about what would bring joy without seeming excessive or out of place. William had arranged for the hamper to be delivered through their network of local helpers, maintaining the fiction that it came from the community support group. He had also ensured that a photographer from the local newspaper would be nearby, documenting the community's Christmas kindness for what everyone believed would be a small, heartwarming local story. On December 23rd, the hamper arrived at the Mitchell house, delivered by Tom Bradley, a local volunteer who had become a regular visitor. Sarah invited him in for tea, as had become their custom. Tom was a retired teacher who had lost his wife the previous year and found purpose in helping others. He had no idea about the royal connection, believing like everyone else that this was simply neighbors helping neighbors. As Tom helped carry in the hamper, neither he nor Sarah noticed the photographer across the street, capturing what appeared to be a simple moment of community kindness. The photographer, Jenny Martinez, was there to document several deliveries for a feature on local Christmas charity efforts. She took a few quick shots and moved on to her next assignment, unaware of the significance of what she had captured. That evening, as Sarah and Emma explored the contents of the hamper, organizing everything for James's homecoming the next day, something extraordinary occurred. Catherine, unable to resist checking on the family one last time before Christmas, had suggested to William that they drive through Ashford on their way to a private engagement. It would be a brief detour, she reasoned, just to see the house and know that all was well. William agreed, understanding his wife's need for closure on this project that had consumed so much of their attention. They traveled in an unmarked car with minimal security, taking a route that would pass by the Mitchell house without stopping. It was meant to be a moment's glance, a final confirmation that their efforts had borne fruit. As their car turned onto the Mitchell's street, they saw something that made William instinctively tell the driver to slow down. A small crowd had gathered outside the house, neighbors who had come to see James, who had just arrived home for his Christmas visit. The scene was one of pure joy, with people embracing and children playing in the snow. Catherine watched Emma run to her father, who was seated in a wheelchair, too weak to stand but beaming with happiness. The little girl threw her arms around him, and even from the car, Catherine could see both their faces shining with tears of joy. It was a moment of such pure love that it took her breath away. What happened next would be debated and discussed for years to come. Some say it was William who made the decision. Others insist it was Catherine. Perhaps it was a mutual, unspoken agreement. But as their car sat at the corner, engine idling, they exchanged a look that communicated everything. This family, this moment, this was why they did what they did. And suddenly, the idea of driving away without acknowledging it seemed wrong. William instructed the driver to pull over. Their security detail, trained to adapt to any situation, quickly but discreetly took positions. William and Catherine stepped out of the car, no fanfare, no announcement. Just two people joining a community celebration. At first, no one noticed them. The focus was entirely on James and his reunion with his family. But then Mrs. Henderson, turning to greet what she assumed were more neighbors, found herself face to face with the future King and Queen of England. Her gasp of surprise caused others to turn, and gradually, like a wave, recognition spread through the crowd. For a moment, there was complete silence. The snow continued to fall, creating an almost magical atmosphere as everyone processed what they were seeing. Then, displaying the warmth and naturalness that had endeared them to the nation, William spoke. "Please," he said, smiling gently, "don't let us interrupt. We were just passing and couldn't help but notice this wonderful scene. It's heartwarming to see a community come together like this." The spell broke, but instead of the chaos that might have been expected, there was a remarkable sense of calm. Perhaps it was the spirit of the moment, or perhaps it was the genuine warmth radiating from the royal couple, but the gathering simply expanded to include them. Catherine moved towards Sarah, who stood frozen in disbelief, still holding Emma's hand. "You must be Sarah," Catherine said softly, extending her hand. "We've heard so much about your family's courage. It's an honor to meet you." Sarah's mind raced, pieces of a puzzle suddenly falling into place. The miraculous turn in their fortunes, the perfectly timed help, the way everything had been handled with such care and discretion. She looked into Catherine's eyes and saw the truth there, the acknowledgement that didn't need words. "Your Highness," Sarah managed, her voice trembling with emotion, but Catherine gently squeezed her hand. "Today, I'm just Catherine," she said. "And this is your day, your family's moment. We're just honored to witness it." William had knelt in the snow beside James's wheelchair, the two men talking quietly. Whatever passed between them in those moments remained private, but observers noticed James straighten slightly, a new light in his eyes. When William stood and placed a hand on James's shoulder, it was a gesture of one man to another, beyond titles or positions. Emma, with the fearlessness of childhood, had been watching the visitors with curious eyes. When Catherine smiled at her, she smiled back and asked the question that would later become legendary. "Are you a real princess?" Catherine laughed, a genuine, delighted sound. "I suppose I am," she said, "but more importantly, I'm a mummy, just like yours. And I think you're very brave, Emma." The photographer, Jenny Martinez, had been alerted by a flurry of text messages and arrived just in time to capture what would become one of the most iconic images in modern royal history. It showed Catherine kneeling in the snow, eye level with Emma, while the little girl showed her a drawing she had made for her father. In the background, slightly out of focus but clearly visible, William stood with his hand on James's shoulder, while Sarah watched with tears streaming down her face. But Jenny was a professional and understood the sensitivity of the moment. Instead of rushing to sell the photo to the highest bidder, she approached William's aide and asked for guidance. The decision was made to hold the image until after Christmas, allowing the family to have their reunion in peace. The royal couple stayed for only about 15 minutes, but in that time, something remarkable happened. The artificial barriers that usually separate royalty from the public seemed to dissolve. They were simply people sharing in a moment of human triumph over adversity. Before leaving, William addressed the small crowd. "What we've witnessed here today is the very best of Britain," he said. "Neighbors helping neighbors, a community refusing to let one family struggle alone. This is what makes our nation special, not palaces or titles, but people who care for one another." Catherine added, "The Mitchell family's strength and dignity in the face of such challenges is inspiring, but equally inspiring is how all of you have rallied around them. This is the kind of story that deserves to be celebrated." They said their goodbyes, with Catherine whispering something to Sarah that made her laugh through her tears. Emma received a gentle hug, and James a firm handshake and a promise that his service to his community would not be forgotten. Then, as quietly as they had arrived, they departed, leaving behind a crowd of stunned but elated neighbors. The rest of Christmas Eve passed in a blur for the Mitchell family. James was home, weak but present, able to share in the decorating of the tree and the hanging of stockings. Emma's excitement was infectious, and for precious hours, they were simply a normal family preparing for Christmas. But the outside world was beginning to stir. Despite the embargo on the photograph, word of the royal visit spread through social media like wildfire. By Christmas morning, reporters were arriving in Ashford, all seeking the story behind this unexpected appearance. The palace's communication team, caught off guard by William and Catherine's spontaneous decision, worked frantically to manage the narrative. They decided on transparency, confirming the visit had taken place, but asking for the family's privacy to be respected during the holiday. On Christmas Day, as the Mitchell family gathered around their small dining table, the turkey Catherine had selected roasting in the oven, they were blissfully unaware of the storm of interest building outside their door. Sarah had drawn the curtains and turned off their phones, determined that this day would belong solely to them. James, propped up with cushions in his chair, watched his daughter play with the simple toys that had appeared under the tree. His appetite had been poor for months, but the aroma of the Christmas dinner stirred something in him, and he managed to eat more than he had in weeks. Sarah held his hand throughout the meal, their fingers intertwined, drawing strength from each other. After dinner, as they sat together in the living room, James spoke about the royal visit for the first time. "Do you know what Prince William said to me?" he asked, his voice stronger than it had been in months. Sarah and Emma leaned in, eager to hear. "He said that he had heard about the work I used to do, helping neighbors with repairs. Never accepting payment. He said that kind of service to community is what knighthoods should be made of. Can you imagine? Me, a carpenter from Ashford?" "You're the bravest man I know," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "Knight or not." As evening fell and James grew tired, they helped him to the sofa where he could rest while still being part of the family gathering. Emma curled up beside him, careful not to jostle him, and began reading from one of the new books that had mysteriously appeared in recent weeks. Her clear voice reading "The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe" filled the room, transporting them all to a magical world where good always triumphed over evil. The photographer's image was released to the media at midnight, as agreed. Within hours, it had spread across the globe, appearing on front pages and trending on every social media platform. The image captured something indefinable, a moment of pure human connection that transcended social boundaries. But it was not just the photograph that captured the nation's attention. As journalists began to piece together the full story, the extent of William and Catherine's involvement became clear. Local volunteers, unaware of the need for secrecy now that the royals had revealed themselves, shared details of the coordinated effort to help the Mitchell family. The story that emerged was one of careful planning, genuine compassion, and a desire to help without seeking recognition. It stood in stark contrast to the performative charity often seen in public life. Here were members of the royal family using their resources and influence not for photo opportunities, but to make a real, lasting difference in one family's life. On Boxing Day, as James returned to the hospital for continued treatment, he found his room filled with cards and flowers from well-wishers across the country. Nurses reported that donations to the hospital's cancer ward had increased dramatically overnight, all inspired by the Mitchell family's story. Sarah, overwhelmed by the attention, initially wanted to hide from it all. But a phone call from Catherine herself changed her mind. The Princess of Wales explained that their story had the power to inspire others, to show that accepting help was not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. She encouraged Sarah to share their experience, not for publicity, but to give hope to other families facing similar struggles. The first interview Sarah gave was to Jenny Martinez, the photographer who had captured the iconic image. They sat in Sarah's now warm kitchen, cups of tea between them, and Sarah spoke honestly about their journey. She talked about the despair of watching her husband suffer while trying to protect their daughter from harsh realities. She spoke of the shame she had felt at being unable to provide and the overwhelming relief when help arrived. "I want people to know that it's okay to need help," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotion. "We live in a society that values independence so highly that we've forgotten we're meant to support each other. What happened to us, it wasn't about charity from on high. It was about community, about people seeing a need and meeting it." She revealed details that hadn't been known before, like how the heating repair had arrived just as they were preparing to spend winter in one room to save money. How the mortgage resolution had come the day before they would have received an eviction notice. The timing, she now understood, had been carefully orchestrated to provide help exactly when it was most needed and would have the most impact. The interview resonated deeply with readers. Sarah's honesty about their struggles and her gratitude for the help received struck a chord with thousands of families facing their own challenges. Letters poured in from across the country, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of hardship and hope. William and Catherine, watching the response from their private residence, felt a deep satisfaction. This was what they had hoped for. Not just to help one family, but to spark a wider conversation about community, compassion, and the responsibility we have to care for one another. They released a brief statement through the palace. "The Mitchell family's story is one of courage, dignity, and the power of community support. We were privileged to play a small part in their journey. But the real heroes are the neighbors, volunteers, and ordinary people who step up every day to help those in need. Their example should inspire us all." As the year drew to a close, the Mitchell family found themselves at the center of a movement they had never sought to start. The Ashford Effect, as some media outlets called it, saw communities across Britain organizing to identify and help families in crisis. Local support groups reported massive increases in volunteers and donations. But for Sarah, James, and Emma, the most important change was more personal. James's treatment was showing positive results, his doctors cautiously optimistic about his prognosis. Sarah had enrolled to complete her education degree with a scholarship that had materialized through the network of support surrounding them. Emma returned to school with new confidence, no longer the worried child trying to be brave for her parents. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks lit up the sky over London, the Mitchell family watched from their living room window. James, home for another brief visit, held his family close. They had survived the worst year of their lives and emerged not broken, but stronger, bound together by love and supported by a community that had refused to let them fall. In another living room, in a much grander house, William and Catherine also watched the fireworks with their children. They thought of the Mitchell family and the unexpected journey that had brought them all together. It had started as a simple desire to help, executed in secret to preserve dignity and avoid spectacle. But it had become something larger, a reminder of what was possible when privilege was used in service of others. The photograph of Catherine kneeling in the snow with Emma continued to circulate, becoming one of those images that defined a moment in time. But for those involved, the real story was not in that single moment, but in all the quiet acts of kindness that had preceded it and all those that would follow. As the clock struck midnight, ushering in a new year, Sarah Mitchell made a resolution. She would use their experience to help others, to be the kind of support for struggling families that had been provided for them. The circle of kindness that had saved them would continue to grow, ripple by ripple, touching lives in ways that no one could fully predict. The secret was out, but rather than diminishing the act of kindness, the revelation had amplified its impact. A nation often divided by politics and circumstances had found common ground in a simple truth: that we are at our best when we care for one another, quietly and without expectation of reward. The new year brought an unexpected transformation across Britain. What had begun as a private act of kindness in a small Kent town had sparked something unprecedented in the national consciousness. The image of Catherine kneeling in the snow with young Emma Mitchell had become more than just a photograph. It had become a symbol of hope and human connection that transcended social boundaries. In the weeks following the revelation of William and Catherine's involvement with the Mitchell family, something remarkable began to happen. Communities across the country started organizing their own support networks, inspired by what they had witnessed. It wasn't orchestrated from above or mandated by government policy. It was a grassroots movement born from the simple recognition that neighbors helping neighbors could transform lives. In Manchester, a group of local business owners established a fund to help families dealing with medical crises. They called it the Silent Kindness Initiative, explicitly modeling it on the royal couple's approach of helping without fanfare. Within a month, they had assisted 12 families, providing everything from mortgage payment support to home repairs. In Glasgow, a retired teacher named Eleanor MacDonald read Sarah Mitchell's interview and was moved to action. She gathered a group of fellow retirees and created a program to provide tutoring and childcare for families where parents were dealing with serious illness. "We have time, we have skills, and we have the desire to help," Eleanor told a local reporter. The Mitchell story showed us that waiting for someone else to act means help might come too late. The movement wasn't limited to large cities. In rural Wales, farming communities that had long practiced informal mutual aid began formalizing their support systems. When a young farmer was diagnosed with a severe illness during lambing season, his neighbors didn't just offer sympathy. They organized a rota to ensure his flock was cared for and his farm continued to operate. Back in Ashford, Sarah Mitchell found herself at the center of this national awakening. Letters arrived daily from people across the country, sharing their own stories and asking for advice. With encouragement from the local council and support from the palace, she established a small foundation called Hope in Community, dedicated to connecting families in crisis with local support networks. The foundation's first meeting was held in the Church Hall of St. Mary's in Ashford. Sarah had expected perhaps a dozen people to attend. Instead, over 200 crowded into the space, with more listening from the corridor. There were social workers, teachers, medical professionals, business owners, retirees, students, and parents, all united by a desire to ensure no family in their community would face crisis alone. Sarah stood at the front of the hall, nervous but determined. She had prepared a speech, but looking at the eager faces before her, she set aside her notes and spoke from the heart. "6 months ago, my family was drowning," she began, her voice clear despite the emotion. We were facing the possible loss of our home. My husband's life hung in the balance, and I was trying to shield our daughter from fears no child should carry. We felt completely alone." She paused, gathering strength from the memory of how far they had come. What saved us wasn't just the financial help, though that was crucial. It was knowing that people cared. It was neighbors who appeared at our door with meals, volunteers who helped with school runs, and yes, the incredible generosity of 2 people who could have ignored our plight, but chose not to. The room was silent, everyone hanging on her words. But here's what I've learned. William and Catherine didn't create the kindness that saved us. They revealed it. It was already there in our community, in your communities. It just needed someone to show us how to channel it effectively. She went on to outline the simple principles that had made their rescue so effective. Identifying families before they reached crisis point, providing help in ways that preserved dignity, coordinating efforts to avoid duplication or gaps, and creating sustainable support rather than temporary fixes. The meeting lasted 3 hours, with participants breaking into groups to discuss how to implement similar systems in their own areas. By the end, 23 communities had committed to establishing their own support networks, all connected under the Hope in Community umbrella. The palace watched these developments with deep satisfaction. William and Catherine had hoped their actions might inspire others, but the scale of the response exceeded their wildest expectations. They decided to publicly support the movement, not as patrons demanding recognition, but as participants in a national effort. In a carefully crafted speech at a charity event in London, William addressed the phenomenon directly. "What we're witnessing across Britain is not a new idea," he said. "It's a return to something we've always known but sometimes forget in our busy lives, that we are stronger together than alone. The Mitchell family's story reminded us all that dignity isn't found in never needing help, but in how we give and receive it." Catherine, speaking at a separate event focused on childhood welfare, was even more personal. "As a mother, Emma Mitchell's quiet wish for her father to come home for Christmas touched me deeply. No child should carry such worries, but children across our nation do every day. What gives me hope is seeing how communities are wrapping around these families, ensuring no child faces such fears alone." The media, initially focused on the royal angle, began highlighting the broader movement. Major newspapers ran series profiling local heroes who were making differences in their communities. The BBC produced a documentary following 5 families who had been helped by community support networks, showing the long-term impact of sustained assistance. One of the most moving segments featured the Mitchell family 6 months after the royal visit. James, while still undergoing treatment, had returned home permanently. His prognosis had improved dramatically, something his doctors attributed partly to the reduction in stress and the improved living conditions. He had even begun working again, taking on small carpentry projects from a workshop Tom Bradley had helped him set up in the garage. Sarah was shown attending university classes, working toward her education degree with a specific focus on supporting children dealing with family crises. "I want to be the teacher who notices when a child is struggling at home," she explained, "the one who can connect families with help before they reach the breaking point." Emma, now confident and thriving, was filmed playing with friends in the same living room where she had once played alone with her worn teddy bear. When asked about meeting the princess, she smiled and said, "She told me princesses need to be kind and brave. I'm trying to be both." The documentary's impact was profound. Donations to community support organizations increased by 400% in the week following its broadcast. More importantly, thousands of people volunteered their time and skills to local initiatives. The movement had achieved what legislation and government programs often struggled to accomplish: genuine community engagement. Corporate Britain took notice as well. Major companies began establishing employee volunteer programs, giving workers paid time to support community initiatives. A consortium of businesses created a national fund to provide emergency support for families in crisis, administered through local networks to ensure help reached those who needed it most. Schools integrated community service into their curricula, teaching children from a young age about the importance of supporting others. In one particularly innovative program in Birmingham, students adopted elderly residents in their neighborhood, visiting regularly and helping with small tasks. The program reduced isolation among the elderly while teaching young people empathy and responsibility. The Church of England, inspired by the movement, launched a nationwide initiative encouraging parishes to establish support networks. The Archbishop of Canterbury, in his Easter sermon, spoke movingly about the theological implications of the Ashford story. "In lifting others, we ourselves are lifted," he said. "In giving hope, we find hope." This is the essence of faith made manifest in daily life. Political leaders, initially caught off guard by the organic nature of the movement, scrambled to show support. The Prime Minister announced new tax incentives for charitable giving and volunteered time. The opposition proposed legislation to protect and support community organizations. For once, there was cross-party agreement on the value of what was happening. But not all responses were positive. Some critics argued that the movement was merely glossing over systematic failures in social support. They pointed out that families shouldn't have to rely on charity, that a proper welfare state should prevent such crises. These voices were important, forcing a national conversation about the balance between government responsibility and community action. Sarah Mitchell herself addressed these concerns in a powerful speech at a national conference on social welfare. "Community support isn't a replacement for proper social services," she said. "It's a complement to them. Yes, we need better systems to prevent families from reaching crisis point, but we also need the human connections that no government program can provide. We need both." As the first anniversary of the royal visit approached, media attention intensified. Everyone wanted to know how the Mitchell family was doing, whether the community support had lasted, and what long-term impact the movement had achieved. The palace, in consultation with the Mitchell family, agreed to a single, comprehensive update. It would be a joint interview with William, Catherine, and the Mitchell family, conducted by a respected journalist in the same church hall where Hope and Community had held its first meeting. The hall was packed once again, this time with a carefully selected audience of families who had been helped, volunteers who had given their time, and community leaders who had established support networks. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. When William and Catherine entered with the Mitchell family, the applause was thunderous. But what struck observers was the easy familiarity between them. This wasn't a formal royal meeting. It was a reunion of people who had shared something profound. The interview began with reflection on that snowy December day. William revealed that stopping had been spontaneous, driven by the simple human need to acknowledge what they were witnessing. "We spend so much time planning every royal engagement," he said. "But sometimes the most important moments are the unplanned ones." Catherine spoke about the letters she had received from families across the country. "Each one tells a story of struggle but also of hope," she said. "What moves me most is how people who have been helped immediately want to help others. It's a beautiful cycle of kindness." James Mitchell, looking healthier than he had in over a year, spoke with quiet dignity about his journey. "There were days when I thought my illness would destroy everything we had built," he said. "What I learned is that while illness can take many things, it can't take community if we don't let it." Sarah talked about her work with Hope in Community, which had now helped coordinate support for over 3,000 families across Britain. "We're not just addressing crises," she explained. "We're rebuilding the social fabric that holds communities together." But it was Emma who provided the moment that would be remembered long after the interview ended. When asked what she had learned from everything that had happened, the now 9-year-old thought carefully before answering. "I learned that being scared is okay if you tell someone," she said, "and that there are lots of kind people in the world. You just have to look for them, and then they help you look for more." The interview concluded with William announcing a new royal patronage for Hope in Community, ensuring its work could continue and expand. But he emphasized that the organization's strength came not from royal endorsement, but from the thousands of ordinary people who made it work. As the event ended and people began to leave, small groups formed throughout the hall. Families who had been helped connected with those currently struggling. Volunteers shared ideas and contact information. The network that had begun with one family's crisis continued to grow and strengthen. Outside, the media waited for the royal couple to emerge. When they did, walking alongside the Mitchell family, the scene was remarkably similar to that snowy day a year earlier. But so much had changed. What had been a moment of crisis intervention had become a sustained movement of national significance. In the following weeks, sociologists and historians began analyzing what they called the Ashford effect. Some traced its roots to British traditions of mutual aid, others to a reaction against increasing social isolation in modern life. But most agreed that its power lay in its authenticity. This wasn't a campaign designed by marketing experts or imposed by authorities. It was a genuine response to genuine need. International observers took notice as well. Delegations from other countries visited British communities to learn about their support networks. The United Nations cited the movement as an example of effective community-based crisis intervention. Academic papers were written analyzing its structure and impact. But for the families at the heart of it all, the analysis mattered less than the daily reality of knowing help was available. In Newcastle, a single mother facing eviction received support that kept her family housed. In Cardiff, a grandfather raising his grandchildren after a family tragedy found himself surrounded by helpers. In London, a refugee family struggling to navigate their new life discovered a community ready to embrace them. The movement faced challenges, of course. Some initiatives struggled with funding, others with volunteer burnout. There were occasional conflicts over resources and approaches, but the core principle remained strong: communities taking responsibility for their most vulnerable members. As the second Christmas since the royal visit approached, the Mitchell family prepared for a very different holiday. James was in remission, his strength gradually returning. Sarah had completed her first term of university with distinction. Emma was thriving in school, her teacher reporting that she had become a natural leader, always the first to notice when a classmate needed help. They received an invitation to attend the Royal Christmas Concert at Westminster Abbey, along with representatives from community support groups across the nation. It would be a celebration not of charity received, but of compassion multiplied. The night of the concert, Westminster Abbey glowed with candlelight. Families from every corner of Britain filled the ancient space, their stories of struggle and triumph creating an invisible tapestry of human resilience. When the choir began to sing, their voices seemed to carry all the hope and gratitude of a nation rediscovering its capacity for kindness. William and Catherine sat with their own children, who had been told stories about the families present. The young princes and princess watched with wide eyes, absorbing lessons about service and compassion that no formal education could provide. During the concert, Sarah Mitchell was invited to read a passage from Dickens's A Christmas Carol. Her voice, once trembling with fear and exhaustion, now rang clear and strong through the Abbey. When she reached the line, "I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year," there was hardly a dry eye in the building. The concert ended with all present joining in Silent Night. As voices rose together from royal to refugee, from volunteer to recipient of help, the words took on new meaning. This had been a year of silent nights made bearable by kindness, of peace found in the midst of struggle through the love of community. As people filed out into the cold December night, the conversations continued. Contact information was exchanged, plans were made, and commitments renewed. The movement that had begun with one family's crisis had become a permanent part of the national landscape. In his Christmas broadcast that year, King Charles III made special mention of the movement. "My son and daughter-in-law's actions reminded us all of a fundamental truth," he said, "that the measure of a society is not in its wealth or power, but in how it cares for those in need. This year, Britain has measured up magnificently." But perhaps the most telling indicator of the movement's impact came from a study conducted by the National Office of Statistics. It found that reported levels of social isolation had decreased significantly over the year, while community engagement had reached its highest level in decades. Mental health services reported fewer crisis interventions in areas with active support networks. Children in supported families showed improved academic performance and emotional well-being. The study concluded with an observation that would have made William and Catherine smile. The data suggests that targeted, dignified community support not only addresses immediate crises, but creates lasting positive change in social cohesion and individual well-being. As the year ended, Sarah Mitchell stood once again at her window, watching snow fall on Ashford. But this time, she wasn't alone. James stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, while Emma played with friends in the warmth of their home. The fear and isolation of 2 years ago seemed like another lifetime. Her phone buzzed with a message from the Hope in Community Network. Another family had been identified as needing help, this time in Scotland. Sarah smiled, knowing that within hours a network of support would spring into action. The family would receive help, dignity intact, and in time, they too would likely become helpers themselves. In a palace not so far away, Catherine was reading bedtime stories to her children. When her daughter asked why they had helped the Mitchell family, Catherine's answer was simple: "Because we could, and because it was right. And look what happened when we did. Thousands of other people realized they could help too." The little princess thought about this for a moment. "So we started something big?" "No, darling," Catherine replied, kissing her goodnight. "We just showed people what was already in their hearts." As Britain slept that night, the networks of care continued their quiet work. Volunteers checked on elderly neighbors, support groups planned their next meetings, and families who had been helped prepared to become helpers. The movement that had begun with a silent act of kindness had found its voice, and that voice spoke of hope, dignity, and the enduring power of human compassion. The nation had indeed been moved like never before, not by grand gestures or political speeches, but by the simple recognition that we are all connected, all vulnerable, and all capable of making a difference in each other's lives. The silent act of kindness had become a symphony of community action, its echoes reaching into every corner of the land. And in Ashford, where it all began, the Mitchell house stood warm and bright against the winter night, a beacon of what was possible when kindness met courage, and when those with much remembered those with little. The story that had started with one family's struggle had become the story of a nation rediscovering its soul,